The Project Shadow lore has been expanded. Yes, after nearly 20 years, we finally have new, substantial Shadow lore in Sonic X Shadow Generations. And as the resident Project Shadow lore master, you know I'll always be here to piece it together for you. With both the Dark Beginnings prologue animation and the actual game itself, there is actually quite a lot to digest, and everything presented might not be as it seems. Welcome to chaomix, and today we've got some Project Shadow lore to sift through. There's a ton of new lore throughout Shadow Generations that we need to talk about, but to do this, we need to go back to the Dark Beginnings. The Dark Beginnings is a 3 mini-episode animated prologue series released before the actual game. It's jam-packed with a ton of exposition relating to the events leading up to the actual game story, and it's here where things get a bit deceiving. Episode 1 starts with what seems to be a flashback scene of Shadow and Maria witnessing the Aurora Borealis from the Space Colony Ark. But suddenly, there's an explosion from across the spacecraft. Shadow rushes to the scene to find Professor Gerald slumped over in front of a Berserk Emerald. Emerald is a special type of robot called a Gizoid, known to be capable of quickly learning and imitating pretty much any weapon or fighting style of its opponent. Now, if you're caught up on the Project Shadow lore, you may also have been taken by surprise by this scene just like I was. And if not, I'm just gonna shill my video summarizing the entire Project Shadow lore up until the release of Shadow Generations. Make sure to go watch this video if you haven't, because all of this new lore builds upon the existing lore. It's all explained here in this video. But the reason this scene is so surprising is because, as far as we knew, Shadow and Emerald never interacted until much later on in Sonic Battle. So, is this fight a retcon? Initially, I thought so, but after taking a step back and keeping a keen eye out, I began to notice a few things that now make me believe otherwise. If we continue with the first episode, it soon becomes apparent that everything we've seen so far seems to be part of a hallucination or nightmare sequence. Even earlier on, when Maria grabs Shadow's hand, we get a glimpse ahead of a traumatizing event yet to happen, the Gun Soldiers' invasion of the Ark. But it's when Shadow's fight with Emerald gets abruptly interrupted with abstract scenes of horrific events of the Space Colony Ark incident, where it becomes 100% clear that this episode doesn't take place in reality. Shadow experiences scenes of the Ark being invaded, Gerald being incarcerated, and even Maria's demise. He quickly snaps to and wakes up, putting an end to his nightmare. So yes, this was in fact a nightmare of events from his past. However, I'd like to take it a step further and say that Shadow is seeing things that never actually happened.
This isn't right.
Yes, this line very specifically, along with what we've come to understand from previous games, leads me to believe that the fight against Emerald was a falsified memory. By who? Well, we'll get into that in a little bit. But again, as far as we knew, Shadow never interacted with Emerald until the events of Sonic Battle. We know that Emerald does go berserk on the Ark at some point, but it's heavily implied this was before Shadow's awakening. Because according to previous Gerald journal entries found in Sonic Battle, and even the new journal entries, which we'll get into later, it was the scientists on the Ark who managed to somehow subdue the robot, not Shadow. And Gerald offered the Gizoid to Gun in the first place in order to buy more time for his Project Shadow experiments, which at the time were showing very lackluster results. This fight scene against Emerald contradicts what's been established, and I think it's totally on purpose. But how do we know this is deceit and not just a simple retcon? Well, it's because of what happens at the last moments of the first episode. We see Shadow wake up from his nightmare in present time, standing in front of a scenic view of the blown up moon from the events of Sonic Adventure 2, which, might I add, is an awesome detail that usually gets swept under the rug. You'll love to see it. But right before this episode ends, we see this view glitch out after Shadow leaves, restoring the moon to its intact state, a state from the past. Now, in my opinion, this can only mean one thing. Shadow's hallucinations of his past aren't only limited to his dreams. This is important to note for the second episode. But anyways, because even after waking up, it seems that Shadow's memories are being manipulated. And this isn't without reason, because if we go back right before Shadow wakes up, we can see him free-falling into this ominous three-eyed figure. Yes, the one responsible for Shadow's hallucinations is none other than Black Doom, who we know makes a comeback in Shadow Generations thanks to the Time Eater. If we go off this assumption, it makes sense why Shadow's present-day knowledge begins to bleed into glimpses of his past. The sequences play out of order, certain details aren't right, and even Shadow comes to notice that things are off.
This is the Guardian Units of Nations. Prepare to be boarded.
The soldiers. They storm the Ark, destroy all evidence, But it's too soon. It's happening too quickly.
Shadow's memories are being manipulated by Black Doom. Episode 2 starts off with another flashback, and once more, we receive contradicting information. On the Ark, Shadow and Maria stare at a Black Arms embryo, and the two discuss how Shadow was created using its DNA. Again, if you're up to date on the Project Shadow lore, this is another scene that may have taken you by surprise. This scene directly contradicts another scene in the game Shadow the Hedgehog. During the ending of the game, Black Doom reveals to Shadow that he was created using Black Arms DNA. This is a shocking revelation to Shadow, and he even goes into slight denial at the reveal, as this was obviously Shadow's first time learning this information. So I raised the question, how could it be that Shadow didn't know about his Black Arms lineage until the end of Shadow the Hedgehog if he apparently already knew about it back on the Ark? Is this a retcon? Well, again, I don't think it is. You see, I believe the end of episode 1 and the beginning of episode 2 are meant to be an immediate transition. If you watch the compilation of the 3 episodes uploaded to the official Sonic the Hedgehog YouTube channel that plays out continuously, this becomes pretty evident. Remember, at the very end of episode 1, we see the moon revert to a restored state, a state from the past. We then immediately jump into another flashback from the past in the next episode. And just like before, I believe that Black Doom is forging falsified flashbacks. But why? What would even be his motive? Well, I think that Black Doom is forcing Shadow to remember the Black Arms and his direct lineage to them. He's deliberately toying with Shadow's memories and emotions in order to weaken his spirit and state of mind. Because just like before, Black Doom wants Shadow to succumb to his control. But Shadow is onto this, as the rest of the episode shows us his plan to return to the Ark to investigate. He meets up with Omega and Rouge, who are working with Gun and attempting to collect intel from Eggman's hidden base in the desert. They all have the same suspicion, that the Black Arms have returned. So the 3 begin to work together to get Shadow a spacecraft to reach the Ark. Episode 3 has the group sneaking Shadow into the Gun headquarters, but they get caught and attacked by a hovering combat unit. The group quickly neutralize it in an awesome combat sequence, and Shadow prepares for his liftoff into space. It's at this moment a defense system kicks in due to the unauthorized launch, but Commander Abraham Tower calls off the attack. Yes, the Gun commander from Shadow the Hedgehog makes a return. This time, he has faith in Shadow's mission, especially after how Shadow saved the Earth from the Black Arms in the past. Shadow makes his way to the Ark, haunted by memories of his past, and this is exactly where Shadow Generations kicks off. So yeah, this was everything the Dark Beginnings brought to the table, but we still have an entire game to cover. This was only the tip of the iceberg. Shadow Generations continues the story, starting with Shadow investigating the space colony Ark. During his investigation, he finds a distortion in reality in a hallway on the Ark. Entering the distortion, Shadow encounters Black Doom's eye, who is quickly defeated. Shadow then comes across the fake yellow emerald Tails forged during Sonic Adventure 2. It was so well crafted that even Shadow could barely tell the difference between the fake and the real yellow emerald he coincidentally had possession of. So he takes the fake emerald, but suddenly the Time Eater appears and drags Shadow into white space, just like he had done to Sonic and the rest of his friends. From here, the story truly begins. Sonic's journey through the events of Sonic Generations and the Shadow's journey throughout the events of Shadow Generations play out in parallel. As Sonic fights to defeat the Time Eater in his white space, Shadow does the same to defeat Black Doom in his. And hovering over Shadow's white space, the eerie black moon slowly awakens as he progresses. Throughout Shadow's journey, he encounters various characters trapped in white space the same as him. Omega, Big the Cat, Rouge, and eventually, Shadow even encounters versions of Maria and Gerald Robotnik, who were brought together in white space through the distortions of the Time Eater. This is obviously a traumatic experience for Shadow, as these are 2 people he had considered family that were violently taken away from him, suddenly appearing again before his eyes. But at the same time, seeing them fills Shadow with an almost guilty sense of joy. Although he knows that he cannot permanently keep them in his timeline, the chance to briefly see them again is both heartwarming yet painful. Black Doom appears before Shadow on several occasions, taunting him with hints of his plan to revive the Black Arms and take over the world using Shadow as a vessel. During his journey, Shadow becomes imbued with several special Black Arms abilities. And although this primes him for Black Doom to take control over him, at the same time it gives Shadow access to incredible feats. Eventually, Shadow crosses paths with Sonic, who challenges him for his emerald. However, while Sonic is on a quest to defeat the Time Eater, we all know that Shadow is on his own quest that also requires an emerald. So the two have no choice but to duke it out for the gem. Just like in base Sonic Generations, Sonic triumphs against Shadow, as we know. However, what we didn't know this entire time was the emerald that Sonic ended up taking from Shadow was the very fake that Shadow had picked up at the beginning of the game. Rouge mentions how eventually they'll need to swap them out again by the end, so Sonic can defeat the Time Eater, but for now, Shadow gets to keep the real emerald to use in his fight against Black Doom. Throughout the game, Shadow is able to collect pages from Gerald Robotnik's journal, and if the player collects every page, we're able to get a glimpse of the events of Project Shadow from Gerald's deteriorating perspective. This is where some of the biggest new revelations of the Project Shadow lore are made. First off, I just have to say that this journal is so well done. It adds so much more detail, answers unanswered questions, and displays Gerald's descent into madness in an incredibly eerie yet powerful way. It even supports and adds evidence to a few widely accepted fan theories, which I'll make sure to explain when we get to them. Anyways, the journal starts out with a note addressed to Abraham Tower, the gun commander from the 2005 hit game Shadow the Hedgehog. The note details how Commander Tower had requested a search for tangible evidence of the gun raid on the Ark 50 years ago. Unfortunately, there wasn't much that was found, as pretty much all the evidence was destroyed. However, there was one item collected after a search of Dr. Eggman's facilities shortly after the events of Sonic Adventure 2, Professor Gerald's journal. Interestingly, it's signed by someone who appears to be a subordinate to Commander Tower, with the initial T. It never becomes clear who this T person is, unfortunately, and it's totally possible that this is just a generic, non-important gun subordinate. Or maybe it is someone important, someone that we even know of. If I had to guess, this could be a clever way of canonizing the character Topaz from Sonic X. Topaz is a gun agent who frequently partners with Rouge in the anime. Sonic X isn't quite canon to the game's continuity, but this could possibly be a nod or attempt to begin bringing elements from X into the mainline canon, but that's just my guess. Anyways, throughout the journal we can find several entries written by the professor. It begins with Gerald describing his two sons, one an archaeologist and one a roboticist. Gerald specialized in both, so it was gratifying to see his sons were two halves of the same whole. Unfortunately, both names are redacted in black ink, so it's impossible to know the exact names of his two sons. Unfortunate, because this is new information to us. But in the preceding entry, we can see that Gerald writes about becoming a grandfather. The name is also redacted, but we know that this is Maria Robotnik. We don't know which son is the father of Maria, the archaeologist or the roboticist, but if I had to guess, I would say it's the archaeologist. The reason I think this is because it would make sense that Eggman, being interested in robotics, would be the son of the roboticist. And we know that Maria and Eggman are cousins, which by default would mean Maria is the daughter of the other brother, the archaeologist. In the next entry, we get to see that Gerald's interest in archaeology comes into play. After deciphering an engraving on a mysterious and ancient ring dug up in a jungle, and I'm pretty sure the redacted portion here is Mystic Ruins, the professor learns of the location of Angel Island. On this island, he finds the shrine of a massive redacted. I believe this redacted set of words is Chaos Emerald, the legendary redacted. I believe this is Master Emerald. The following entry goes on to explain that Gerald would take on the project of constructing the Space Colony Ark, the ninth wonder of the world, and most of its funding comes from redacted. This word should be gun. Rouge mentions this in the third episode of Dark Beginnings, that Gun funded the research for Project Shadow. But we knew about this already anyways. The next entry details how Gerald and his team managed to acquire one of the legendary, this word should be Chaos Emeralds. Their limitless source of power is common knowledge, and the group begins researching its possibilities. However, Gun wants to use their power to develop weapons, something that Gerald detests. He even goes as far as to ask the President of the United Nations to intervene. The President agrees, but in the process begins conversation for concept of another equally absurd project, a means to develop the formula for immortality. Gerald flat out refuses, but feels like he could have been more diplomatic about it. The professor was also recently informed that Maria was sick with no diagnosis yet, which adds more stress and concern on top of his already high-pressure situation at his job. The next page shows us our first glimpse at Gerald's concerning mental state with violent, crudely scribbled words. There's a lot redacted here too, but this is actually a snippet from Gerald's diary found within the game Sonic Rivals 2. Luckily, we can use this to see what the redacted words are and read it more legibly. The all-powerful Ifrit. The Ifrit held the power of destruction and the power to bind one's soul. The Ifrit destroyed the entire and the entry gets cut off there. And in case you're wondering what this Ifrit is an interdimensional beast from Sonic Rivals 2, who Gerald had researched at some point. It isn't super deep, this is just the big bad from the spin-off PSP game, but it's super cool that this detail was added into the journal for completion's sake. Anyways, the next entry explains the discovery of Emerald. This entry is a slightly modified version of Gerald's journal entry from Sonic Battle. There is some new information here though. It's revealed that it was actually Gerald's archaeologist's son who had discovered the Gizoid. The specimen that Gerald theorized was created by an ancient civilization was being stored on the Ark, and during Gerald's research on the Chaos Emerald, the robot began to move. The professor then theorized that the robot could harness the gem's power, and could even have been responsible for the destruction of the fourth great civilization from long ago. The preceding entry gets a bit tricky. It's torn off in the corner and a lot of the text gets cut off, making the entire segment a bit difficult to understand. But thankfully, this is another existing entry taken from Sonic Battle. The professor talks about a stone tablet that mentions the event of a figure falling from the heavens and joining all that exists into one. The professor also details how Emerald would watch and mimic Gerald's movements. Scanning the robot would cause his computer to crash, but the data suggested that the Gizoid held knowledge on every combat and weapon of its age. It also potentially had the ability to absorb everything of the modern age, and if true, could possibly become an unstoppable, world-ending being. The next page details Maria's illness, finally diagnosed as neuroimmunodeficiency syndrome, which has no cure. Thankfully, the professor was able to pull some strings to have Maria live on the Ark, since the low gravity could help keep her illness in remission. What we tragically learn from this though is that her family was very against this decision, as this obviously meant they wouldn't be able to see their daughter. However, Maria would become like a big sister to another child on board the Ark, little Abraham, also known as the Gun Commander, who the note at the beginning of the journal was addressed to. It stated that he was the Ark's happy little accident, which implies he was conceived and born on the Ark. That's actually pretty funny. We also learned that the president begins to become very pushy about this immortality project, adding to Gerald's stress. In the following entry, the professor mentions how Gun threatens to cancel their funding unless Gerald dedicates his time into weapons research. And even after agreeing to the president's quest for immortality, Project Shadow, there was no intervening against Gun's wishes. Gerald then describes his findings of an ancient deity known as Chaos. This portion of the journal confirms a widely accepted fan theory that Gerald saw the mural on Angel Island depicting perfect chaos and used it as inspiration for his work. With this information, he begins work on the artificial chaos, AI-driven creatures that can take form from water. Gun intended them to be used as weapons, but Gerald secretly had hoped that they could be used as search and rescue units. The next journal entry confirms that Gerald had fully begun his research into Project Shadow, the formula for immortality. First, he would need to figure out how to siphon chaos energy into living tissue. Thus, he began to develop the chaos drives. He would soon begin his test on salamanders because of their regenerative abilities. And we get this adorable picture of Maria holding what is most likely the bio-lizard, back when it was just a regular baby salamander. Man, that's actually so sad. Anyways, in order to keep Gun from breathing down his neck, he would reluctantly supply them with these chaos drives in order to power their machinery. The entry after this one is where things get a bit grim. The salamander that Gerald had been testing the chaos drives on would see rapid growth, but it would be to the point where it couldn't even support its own biological systems. External life support machinery was created to help the creature continue living. It would also continue to grow more violent as it grew. Surprisingly though, it exhibited strange reactions of energy. We know this to be the beginnings of chaos control. Gerald is forced to store the lizard in a specialized room, and he mentions how he'll never have the heart to tell Maria what actually happened to the poor salamander. The next entry describes Gerald's admiration for Maria and her strength, even on her worst days when her sickness is at its most taxing. She truly believes that her grandfather's research will cure her, but at the same time, Maria's absence on Earth takes a toll on their family's relationship. Gerald feels guilty as he can neither cure his granddaughter's illness or bring her back home yet. This pressure to save his granddaughter's life feels heavier than the pressure from all of his work combined. The preceding entry shows us that Gerald had become desperate and called upon the Black Comet for aid in the development development of Project Shadow. This is where Black Doom comes into play and offers Gerald a Faustian deal. Black Doom's DNA, which would provide the artificial lifeform immortality and the mastered ability of chaos control, for the same lifeform's aid in a dubious and vague plan the alien race planned out for 50 years in the future. Gerald accepts, however, he is confident that he will play him for a fool when the time comes. Gunn as well. So with Black Doom's help, he is able to successfully create the ultimate lifeform. The next entry describes how Maria had turned Gerald's pessimism into optimism. Gerald had initially named the project as Project Shadow due to him thinking it impossible, as intangible as a shadow. However, Maria would put things in a new perspective by saying a shadow tells you which way to go to find the light. She would go on to call the unfinished specimen Shadow, and from there Gerald decided that Shadow would be created to champion light and hope rather than darkness. This realization strengthened Gerald's resolve to save his granddaughter. The entry after this would reveal that Gerald discovered the meaning of the word gizoid. It meant everything. The gizoid are capable of establishing links with someone after a display of power, so the professor would show off and fire his model guns in front of the robot. From that point on, a link would be established between the two, and the gizoid would listen to no one but Gerald. The next entry tells how Gerald would become desperate to buy more time in the development of Project Shadow, anything to save his granddaughter. So even though it posed an immense risk, he gave the gizoid to Gunn to convince them to keep funding up for the project. However, before he did so, he would command the gizoid not to follow instructions from anyone but him. There was only one problem. The gizoid's link can be overridden by someone showing them power exceeding that of its former master. The following entry explains how the gizoid did not impress Gunn. As a result, Gerald would build the Eclipse Cannon. He designed it to be powerful, too powerful even. One blast targeting anything on Earth would destroy the entire planet. So while yes, Gerald did invent a powerful weapon for Gunn, they'd never be able to ethically use it, essentially rendering it useless to them. However, Gerald had the foresight to create it specifically to counter the Black Arms in the future. He would name the Eclipse Cannon after Shadow. This would be Gerald's aid to Shadow for an inevitable future battle he'd never asked for. The next entry reveals that Maria actually helped design the shoes and accessories that Shadow wears. It would enhance his mobility and help Shadow contain his energy, since his body would be under immense strain from the excess expenditure of chaos energy. We know these as his hover shoes and his limiter rings. Gerald also mentions studying the science behind chaos control, hoping to understand it before Shadow's awakening to aid him in learning how to utilize it. Back on Earth, there is a continuing growing rift between his family members, specifically his two sons. Gerald becomes saddened by the pain his research is causing his family. The next entry has Gerald describing the completion and awakening of Shadow. He is a capable specimen, but most of all, his bond with Maria is unlike anything Gerald has ever witnessed. The two are inseparable, and it truly moves the professor. Meanwhile, on Earth, the professor mentions how Maria's family had been blessed with another daughter. This is the first we've ever heard, but Maria had a younger sister apparently. However, Gerald believes that it's because of his family's pessimism and his abilities to save their first daughter, so it's bittersweet news. He becomes desperate to get his family back. This next entry is from Sonic Battle. It details how Emerald would go berserk after having absorbed too much new combat information. It would destroy most of the space colony arc, but eventually would be subdued by researchers. Now, I want to point out here how Shadow Generation specifically puts this journal entry after the awakening of Shadow. This context is new, however, the journal entry is the same as it was in Sonic Battle. Back then, it was implied that Emerald's rampage took place before Shadow's awakening, but it technically wasn't 100% confirmed. This is because it was the researchers who had subdued him, not Shadow. That's how it was described back then, and how it's described now. I find it interesting that it has no mention of Shadow putting a stop to or even encountering Emerald. For this reason, I'm still pretty sure that the scene from the Dark Beginnings of the two fighting never actually happened. Anyways, the entry then goes on to describe how Gerald would need to reprogram Emerald's AI to one based on free will and emotion, since destroying it was an impossibility. The preceding entry explains how Emerald's destruction caused the artificial chaos to act erratically. This is an explanation of the events of the level Lost Impact from the game Shadow the Hedgehog. Shadow would pacify the artificial chaos swiftly, however, an automatic SOS call would be sent to Gunn, which concerned Gerald. What would they think of yet yet another one of Gerald's experiments going berserk. First it was the bio-lizard, then Emerald, and now even the artificial chaos. Would Shadow be next? This final blunder is what would eventually lead Gunn to raiding the Ark. Now, from this point on, the rest of the journal entries come from pieces of existing Gerald journals found throughout various Sonic games. The next entry comes from Sonic Battle, luckily, because this is another really messy one that would be hard to read otherwise. A heritage of a past I dug out, Gizoid, and the ultimate lifeform I created by my own hands, Shadow. I equipped both weapons with Heart. If all powers are not what is to be obtained for oneself, but what is to be born from hearts that yearn for someone, I believe all conflicts should cease to exist. Please, if there is anyone listening to my prayers, bring hope to humanity. The next one is another messy one, but again, thankfully it's an existing entry readable in Sonic Adventure 2.
I don't quite know what happened or what went wrong. Was it a mistake to create the ultimate life form? I thought it would be something that would benefit mankind, but then the military guards landed on the colony that day. They were sent to destroy the research project that I had been working on. My colleagues at the research facility, my granddaughter, Maria, I hope you are all safe.
We then see a series of zeros and ones. This is binary and would be totally possible to translate to English normally, but with all of the smudges, it's hard to tell the exact values. For now at least, this might be unsolvable, unfortunately. The next part reads,
The colony was completely shut down, probably to keep the prototype from falling into the wrong hands.
The Ark was shut down under the premise that there had been an accident.
And the final entry of Gerald's journal is another from Sonic Adventure 2. It explains, as we all know, that Gerald would find Maria's name among the list of those who died on the Ark during its raid. He describes his descent into madness and how the completed Shadow the Hedgehog would be left to fill the world with destruction.
I found Maria's name among those who died when the Ark was shut down. She meant everything to me, and I couldn't bear the thought that she died because of my research. I lost everything. I had nothing more to live for. I went insane. All I could think about was to avenge her. Somehow, some way. I got scared as I no longer was able to control my thoughts. All I could think about was that I wanted it all based on my original projections. I was able to complete my project, Shadow. I designed its mind to be perfect, pure. I will leave everything to him. If you wish, release and awaken it.
And that's the end of Gerald Robotnik's journal. Overall, an excellent summary of the Project Shadow lore. It eloquently fills in the blanks on a lot of things and answers a lot of long-standing unanswered questions. Are there still some unanswered questions? Sure. But this was honestly everything I could have hoped for and did such a fantastic job of giving justice to this amazing story. But we aren't done here just yet, because we've still got a day to die for with Black Doom. Eventually, Shadow gains his final Black Arms ability and awakens to his true power. With this, Shadow is able to reach the Black Moon. The Black Moon then distorts white space and opens up, releasing enemies into its vicinity. Shadow makes his way through, and jumps in to confront Black Doom once and for all. Transforming into Devil Doom once more, the two fight across a distorted radical highway. And just as Shadow is about to seemingly defeat his mortal enemy, Devil Doom ups the ante and transforms into a new, more powerful form, Neo Devil Doom. But continuing on using all of his strength, Shadow pushes forward and defeats the Eldritch Beast. Neo Devil Doom is defeated, and the revival of the Black Arms is thwarted. Shadow returns to white space to see the Professor and Maria, who begin to fade away back into their timeline 50 years into the past. Shadow knows of their gruesome fate that they will soon meet, and somehow, the Professor has a feeling of the events that will soon unfold as well. Maria knows that there's a possibility that the two may never meet again, but even so, she wants Shadow to keep her in his heart. Fighting back with every ounce of strength he has to for once be selfish and keep them with him, he turns away to let them go. Shadow is seen running past Rouge, shedding a single tear off screen, which softly grazes her. She knows that Shadow just had to do probably one of the hardest things he's ever had to do. But even so, the two make their way to replace the fake Emerald they had juked Sonic out with the real one to support him in his final fight against the Time Eater. Yeah, I don't think I can ever look at this scene from Sonic Generations the same again.
On your feet.
Man, Shadow Generations doesn't just add more detail to Project Shadow's story, it puts it in an entirely new perspective. We finally get to see Shadow once again face his past and deal with secrets that seem like they were 20 years in the making. A lot of this new information gives us a deeper look at Gerald's struggles and shows how everything he did led to creating Shadow. Truly, all Gerald wanted was to piece together his broken family, and that makes this already tragic story even more tragic than we even knew. Like I said before, the Project Shadow lore is one of the greatest plotlines in all of Sonic history, and hopefully all these additions cemented it as your favorite as well. My original Project Shadow video, which is my #1 video of all time and first ever video to reach 1 million views, is kind of what really put me on the radar for a lot of people on YouTube. We've come a long way since then, and I'm really glad that I got to experience this update to Shadow's lore 20 years in the making with you guys. Anyways, I guess I'll have to find another character to explain the entire lore of as passionately as I did with Shadow. And there's really only one other candidate, the random f***ing eagle from Kingdom Valley, Gary the Eagle.